Donald Trump's proposed tariffs on Mexican goods, recently announced to take effect on August 1st, 2025, represent a significant escalation in trade tensions between the two countries. While the stated reasons for these tariffs include concerns over drug trafficking, particularly fentanyl, and persistent trade deficits, the potential economic fallout for both nations could be substantial. Economic ramifications. These tariffs, initially set at 30% and potentially increasing if Mexico retaliates, threaten to disrupt deeply integrated supply chains, especially in industries like automotive, electronics, and agriculture. Mexico is a vital trading partner for the U.S., and many American businesses rely on Mexican components and finished goods. Imposing such duties would raise costs for U.S. consumers, as companies would likely pass on the increased import expenses. For Mexico, heavily reliant on exports to the U.S., around 80% of its total exports, the tariffs could lead to reduced demand for its products, factory slowdowns, and job losses. While the depreciation of the Mexican peso might partially offset the tariff impact by making Mexican goods cheaper, it also increases the cost of imported inputs for Mexican manufacturers. Political and diplomatic fallout. Beyond economics, these tariffs are a political tool aimed at pressuring Mexico on issues like border security and migration. However, this approach risks undermining trust and cooperation between the two neighbors. Mexico has strongly condemned the tariffs as unfair, but has also expressed willingness to negotiate. The situation highlights the delicate balance Mexico must strike between defending its sovereignty and maintaining its crucial trade relationship with the U.S. Uncertainties and future outlook. The full impact remains uncertain, particularly regarding whether goods covered by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, will be exempt. While the USMCA provides mechanisms for dispute resolution, using tariffs as leverage could strain the agreement's long-term durability. Mexico is exploring strategies like diversifying its trade relationships, though this is a long-term endeavor. The current situation underscores the volatility of trade policy and the need for businesses to adapt to rapidly changing global economic landscapes. Donald Trump's announced 30% tariffs on Mexican goods, set to begin August 1st, 2025, stem from several key motivations, primarily centered on border issues and trade imbalances. Combating drug trafficking. The most prominent stated reason is Mexico's perceived insufficient efforts to stop the flow of fentanyl and other illicit drugs into the United States. Trump has repeatedly asserted that Mexico has not stopped the cartels who are trying to turn all of North America into a narco-trafficking playground. This directly links the tariffs to national security concerns, arguing that the unchecked drug flow poses a major threat to American lives and safety. Addressing trade deficits. Another significant justification is the long-standing trade deficit the U.S. has with Mexico. Trump views these deficits as unsustainable and a sign of unfair trade practices. He advocates for policies that would promote domestic manufacturing and bring the companies back to the U.S. Tariffs, in this context, are seen as a tool to incentivize production within American borders, ultimately aiming to rebalance trade relationships, pressuring on border security and immigration. Beyond drugs, the tariffs are also intended as leverage to pressure Mexico to do more to secure its border and curb undocumented immigration into the U.S. While not always explicitly the sole reason, the linkage between trade and border control has been a recurring theme in Trump's approach to Mexico. He argues that Mexico's cooperation on these issues has been not enough. In essence, Trump's tariffs on Mexico are a multifaceted strategy aiming to address what he perceives as critical failures in Mexico's handling of drug trafficking and border security, alongside a desire to rectify trade imbalances in favor of the United States. The impending 30% tariffs on Mexican goods, set to take effect on August 1st, 2025, carry a range of significant consequences for both the United States and Mexico, impacting economies, supply chains, and diplomatic relations. Economic fallout. For the United States, these tariffs will likely lead to higher consumer prices as the cost of imported goods from Mexico, ranging from agricultural products like tomatoes to manufactured goods like auto parts, increases. This directly affects American households and businesses that rely on these imports. U.S. industries, particularly the automotive sector, will face higher input costs due to their deeply integrated supply chains with Mexico. This could translate into reduced profitability for companies and potentially job losses if production slows or shifts. For Mexico, heavily dependent on exports to the U.S., the consequences will be severe. A blanket 30% tariff could reduce its GDP by an estimated 2.5%. Mexican industries will see a sharp decline in demand for their products, leading to factory slowdowns, job losses, and economic instability. While some argue that tariffs could incentivize nearshoring, moving production closer to the U.S., like to Mexico, the immediate impact is largely negative. Mexico's peso may depreciate further, increasing the cost of its imports. Supply chain disruptions. The tariffs will inevitably disrupt complex and efficient supply chains that have been built over decades under free trade agreements like NAFTA and USMCA. Industries like automotive, electronics, and even food production rely on the seamless flow of goods and components across the U.S.-Mexico border. Introducing significant tariffs will force companies to reassess their sourcing strategies, potentially leading to delays, increased logistical costs, and a search for alternative, possibly more expensive suppliers. This will be a significant challenge for businesses operating on just-in-time inventory models. Political and diplomatic tensions. The imposition of these tariffs, particularly when tied to issues like drug trafficking and immigration, will strain the diplomatic relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. While Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has emphasized a cool head and a willingness to negotiate, Mexico has also called the tariffs unfair. This friction could undermine cooperation on other critical bilateral issues, including security, border management, and shared economic development initiatives. It also raises the specter of retaliatory tariffs from Mexico, which could further escalate the trade dispute and harm U.S. exports to Mexico. Addressing the looming 30% tariffs on Mexican goods requires a multi-pronged approach, focusing on diplomacy, economic adaptation, and internal policy adjustments from both the United States and Mexico. Diplomatic engagement and negotiation. The most immediate solution lies in intense diplomatic negotiations between the U.S. and Mexican governments. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has already indicated a willingness to negotiate, advocating for a cool head. These discussions should aim to clarify the scope of tariffs, determine if goods compliant with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, will be exempt, as this significantly impacts the range of affected products. Address core concerns. The U.S. needs to clearly articulate its specific demands regarding fentanyl trafficking and border security. Mexico, in turn, must present concrete, verifiable steps it is taking or plans to take to address these issues. Utilize USMCA dispute mechanisms. The USMCA framework offers established avenues for consultation and dispute resolution, which should be prioritized over unilateral tariff impositions. Engaging through these existing channels can foster stability and long-term investment. Economic adaptation strategies. Both nations and their businesses need to prepare for potential tariff implementation. For U.S. businesses, companies should diversify supply chains beyond Mexico where feasible, explore alternative sourcing, and renegotiate contracts with suppliers to account for potential tariff costs. Some might consider inventory hoarding or leveraging free trade zones to defer duties. For Mexican businesses, Mexico should diversify its export markets beyond the U.S., though this is a long-term strategy. Additionally, it can focus on strengthening domestic production and potentially attracting more nearshoring investments from companies seeking to avoid tariffs on goods from other regions. Businesses should also rigorously comply with USMCA rules of origin to maximize the chances of tariff exemptions. Internal policy adjustments. Mexico's internal reforms. To address U.S. concerns about fentanyl, Mexico can enhance its efforts in combating drug cartels, strengthening law enforcement, and increasing cooperation with U.S. agencies on intelligence sharing and interdiction. On immigration, Mexico could bolster its own border enforcement and transit policies. U.S. internal focus. The U.S. should also acknowledge that the fentanyl crisis has demand-side roots and invest in public health initiatives, treatment, and prevention programs to reduce drug consumption within its borders. Ultimately, a sustainable solution hinges on a return to cooperative engagement that recognizes the deep economic integration and shared challenges between the two countries, rather than relying on punitive trade measures.